Thomas Langston figured he knew this land. He'd spent 35 years walking it, working it, breathing it in until it felt like part of his own skin. He knew the groan of the farmhouse porch in the summer heat and the sharp crack of frozen timber in the winter cold. He especially knew the old barn his grandfather, Samuel, had put up with his own 2 hands nearly a century ago. Every splintered beam, every rusted nail, every dusty corner held a story he thought he'd heard 1,000 times. But that evening, as the sun bled out behind the western hills, the barn told him a new one. He was just walking across the floorboards, the way he did every night. The worn wood usually gave a solid, dependable thud under his boots. It was the sound of home, the sound of packed earth and solid foundations. Tonight, something was different. One patch of floorboards didn't thud. It echoed, a hollow drumming sound like something was empty underneath. He stopped dead. That wasn't right. He pressed his boot down again, harder this time. Thump, thump. The sound was wrong. It was the sound of a secret. His grandfather was a man of straight lines and honest work. He built things to last, not to hide. Thomas had been raised on stories of his integrity, his strength, his unshakable character. A man like that didn't leave empty spaces under his floors. And yet the wood seemed to whisper that he had. A cold knot tightened in Thomas's gut. He got down on his hands and knees, pressing his ear to the dusty planks. The hollow sound was clearer now, undeniable. It wasn't rot. It wasn't a shifted joist. It was a void, a deliberately constructed space just waiting to be found. He grabbed a crowbar from the tool wall, the cold iron heavy in his hand. He wedged the tip under the edge of a board, expecting to fight it, to hear the shriek of old nails pulled from their home. Instead, the board lifted easily. Too easily. He pulled up a second, then a third. They came away as if they'd been arranged for quick removal, not nailed down for a lifetime. And beneath them, a perfect dark rectangle opened up in the barn floor, a maw of shadow that swallowed the last of the evening light. Wooden steps, worn smooth by years of use he couldn't imagine, descended into the black. This wasn't a sinkhole. It wasn't a cellar for storing preserves. It was an entrance that had been waiting, silent and patient, for decades. Thomas stared into the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd always believed this barn held his family's memories. Now, for the first time, he realized it might be guarding their secrets instead. And he was about to find out just how deep they went. He took a steadying breath and struck a match. The sulfur flared, a tiny, defiant sun against the overwhelming dark. The flame trembled as he lowered it into the opening, and he started down the narrow steps. The air grew cool and still, thick with the smell of damp earth and thyme. Dust coated the walls in a thick gray blanket. But it wasn't the dust that made the breath catch in his throat. It was the footprints. They were pressed into the fine powder on every step, leading down into the darkness ahead. Clear, sharp impressions, a man's boot not much different from his own, and they weren't old, fossilized prints from his grandfather's time. The edges were crisp. The dust hadn't had time to settle back in. These were fresh, days old at most. Someone else had been down here. Someone had been walking through a secret tunnel under his land, a tunnel he never even knew existed. Thomas crouched, his fingers hovering over the heel of a print. It was perfect, undeniable. His mind reeled. He lived alone. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles of bad road away. No one came out to the Langston place without a good reason, and no one had permission to set foot in his barn. So who was this ghost, moving silently beneath his feet? The match flickered, threatening to die. He struck another. As he moved forward, the narrow beam of light revealed more of the tunnel's construction. The walls weren't just rough-dug earth. They were reinforced with heavy wooden support beams, measured and spaced with an expert's eye. This wasn't some desperate hideout dug in a hurry. This was professional, planned, built to last. Whoever made this place wasn't just passing through. They had intended to stay. The narrow passage suddenly opened into a wider chamber, a room carved right out of the earth. And what he saw there sent a jolt of ice through his veins. In the center of the room sat a simple wooden table and a leather chair. The chair was turned slightly, as if its occupant had just gotten up. On the table, a tin cup held a few sips of water, still clear, not stagnant. Beside it, a plate held crumbs from a recent meal. These weren't artifacts from his grandfather's era. This was evidence of life, happening right now. Someone had been sitting in that chair, eating at that table, drinking from that cup just hours or days before. This wasn't a forgotten relic. It was a secret, underground home. And with a sickening, dawning horror, Thomas realized he wasn't just discovering the past. He was trespassing in someone else's present. He was not alone. Every object in the chamber felt wrong. It was his family's land, his barn, but this space belonged to a stranger who was treating this hidden tunnel not as a temporary refuge, but as a place to live. The blankets on a narrow cot in the corner were folded neatly. A stack of books sat on a crude wooden shelf. His eyes were drawn to one of them. The leather cover was soft with age, the corners worn smooth. He picked it up carefully, the old paper fragile beneath his fingers. He opened it to the first page, and the world tilted on its axis. Written there in bold, familiar strokes were the words, "Property of Samuel Langston, 1851. Thomas froze, the book trembling in his hand. It was his grandfather's name, his grandfather's handwriting, the same looping S and sharp L he'd seen on countless deeds and farm ledgers stored up in the house. The man who built the barn, the man who raised him, the man he'd revered his entire life. But these books had never been in the house. He'd been through all his grandfather's things after he passed. These had been kept down here, hidden, preserved in the silent earth. Why would his grandfather keep a personal library in a secret tunnel? His hand shaking, he set the book down and his eyes fell on a small metal box tucked under the table. It was rusted shut, but he found a loose rock and pried the latch. It snapped open with a sharp click, revealing a trove of yellowed papers. He pulled them out. There were property deeds to parcels of land he'd never heard of, in counties he didn't recognize. There were letters signed with unfamiliar names, discussing shipments and payments in coded language. And there were folded maps, hand-drawn, marked with strange red lines that seemed to trace veins deep within the earth. Each document was another piece of a puzzle he didn't understand, a story his family had never told. But it was the photograph at the very bottom of the box that stopped his heart. It was a sepia-toned print, the edges curling with age. It showed three men standing proudly in front of his barn. Except the barn looked brand new, and there were other structures in the background, sheds and a smithy that had been torn down long before he was born. One of the men was unmistakably his grandfather, Samuel. Younger, leaner, with a fire in his eyes Thomas had only ever seen in faded portraits. But the other two men were strangers. Their faces were hard, their eyes sharp, and they stood with a possessive confidence, as if the land already belonged to them. They weren't just partners. They looked like conspirators. Thomas turned the photograph over, his breath held tight in his chest. He was expecting a date, maybe a name. Instead, he found words. A short, chilling sentence scrolled in his grandfather's own hand. The agreement holds. The land stays divided. No one speaks of what happened here. SL 1852. The match burned down to his fingers, and he dropped it with a hiss. He lit another, the flame dancing wildly as he read the words again. And again? What agreement? What land divided? And the most terrifying question of all, what happened here that had to be buried in absolute silence? The grandfather he knew was a pillar of the community, a man whose integrity was legend. But these words hinted at a different man entirely, a man who made secret pacts and demanded silence, a man with something to hide. This tunnel was no longer just a curious discovery. It felt like a confession, a dark secret carved into the earth, waiting for someone to finally read the words. And Thomas, whether he was ready for it or not, had just broken a silence that had lasted for generations. His eyes darted back to the table, to the small metal dish beside the plate. Fresh wax clung to its rim. The stub of a candle sat in the center, the wick still black from a recently extinguished flame. He touched the wax. It was soft, pliable, not old and brittle. A faint line of ash dusted the wood beside it. This wasn't from days ago. This was from hours ago, maybe less. His pulse, which had been a steady drum of shock, now kicked into a frantic, terrified rhythm. Someone had been sitting right here, in this chair, reading by candlelight, not long before he'd found the entrance. Someone could still be close. The thought had barely formed when a loud groan echoed from above. The barn, the floorboards, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, purposeful. Not the scuttling of a raccoon or the random creak of a settling foundation. This was a person who knew exactly where they were going. The steps moved across the planks overhead, circling once before stopping, directly above the hidden entrance. Thomas lunged back against the tunnel wall, instinctively blowing out his match, plunging himself into absolute darkness. Every nerve in his body screamed. His own heartbeat was a thunder in his ears, so loud he was sure they could hear it up above. Whoever it was, they knew. They had to know. They were standing right on top of the secret door. Then a voice cut through the floorboards, clear, calm, and unmistakably female. "You can come up now, Thomas. I know you're down there." His breath hitched. His name. She said his name. How could anyone know his name? How could anyone know about this tunnel, this secret room that he himself had only just found? And yet she spoke with the calm assurance of someone who had been waiting for him, expecting him. He swallowed against the dryness in his throat, summoning a courage he didn't feel. "I'm not going anywhere," he shouted back, his voice cracking. "Not until you tell me who you are and what this is." There was a pause. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then the voice came again, measured and firm, with no hint of threat, but absolute certainty. "That's exactly why I'm here, but I'd rather not explain it through a foot of wood. My name is Clara Harrow, and I've been waiting 3 months for you to find what lies beneath your barn." Thomas climbed the wooden steps, every creak of the wood a gunshot in the tense silence. When his head cleared the floorboards, he saw her. She was standing by a hay bale, bathed in the soft light of a lantern she'd placed on the ground. She wasn't large or imposing, but she stood with a stillness that spoke of unshakable resolve. Her dark hair was tied back, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. "My name is Clara Harrow," she said again, her voice even. "And before you ask, yes, I know who you are, Thomas Langston. I know your grandfather was Samuel. I know you've lived here alone since he passed, and I know you only found that tunnel today." She paused, letting the words sink in. "That was no accident. I've been waiting for this moment." She reached down to a weathered leather satchel at her feet and unfastened the straps. From it she pulled a thick folder tied with string, its edges yellowed and soft with time. She held it out to him. Thomas took it, his calloused farmer's hands feeling clumsy against the fragile paper. He untied the string and opened the folder. Inside, written in his grandfather's familiar, elegant script, was a contract, dated 1852. The ink was faded, but the words were clear, and they described something his mind struggled to grasp. It wasn't a deed. It was an agreement, a pact between 3 families, Langston, Harrow, and Cross, for the shared ownership and stewardship of the land beneath his feet. It outlined a bizarre, complex arrangement, a rotation of residency to avoid suspicion, a vow of absolute secrecy from all outside authorities, a promise of silence about whatever it was they had discovered here. This wasn't about a ranch. It was about concealing something monumental. And at the bottom, the three signatures that changed his entire world: Samuel Langston, Thomas Harrow, William Cross. Thomas looked up from the page, his eyes narrowing. Clara's expression was unreadable, but her voice was firm. "My great-grandfather was Thomas Harrow," she said. "According to this contract, my family has always owned 1/3 of this land, the land you've called yours your whole life. We honored the pact. We stayed away. We kept quiet, just as the agreement dictated." Her gaze locked with his, and her next words landed like stones. "But the contract has an expiration date, 100 years, and that date is next month. When it expires, the Harrows and the Crosses will reclaim what is rightfully theirs. This ranch, this barn, and whatever secrets are in those tunnels. They will no longer belong to you alone." The air in the barn grew thick and heavy, charged with the weight of a century of silence. Thomas looked from the contract in his hands to the determined woman in front of him. What he had always believed to be his inheritance was, in fact, a ticking clock, and time had just run out. Clara insisted on seeing the tunnel for herself. She followed him back down the creaking steps, her own lantern now casting sharp, dancing shadows on the walls. The dust, disturbed by his earlier passage, still hung in the air. "I've never been down here before," she admitted, her voice tight with a mixture of awe and apprehension. "My family only had maps, crude drawings showing the location of the entrance, but nothing about what was inside. Whatever has been going on down here recently, it wasn't me." Thomas said nothing, though a sliver of suspicion remained. They stepped into the main chamber together. He pointed a trembling finger at the table, the damp cup, the fresh crumbs, the soft, pliable wax of the recently used candle. Clara knelt, her fingers brushing over the wax. It bent slightly under her touch. Her face darkened. "Someone has been here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Within the last day, maybe even the last few hours." The place was too tidy to be abandoned. The blankets on the cot were folded. The books were stacked neatly. Dust covered the floor, but it was disturbed by streaks and paths, the marks of someone pacing, moving, living in this underground space. Whoever was using this chamber wasn't just hiding out. They were maintaining it, as if they had every right to be here. Thomas picked up the folder of documents he'd found in the metal box. He handed her a letter written in a precise, unfamiliar hand. She scanned it quickly, her lips moving silently as she read. She looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "It says they found something. Something that would change everything for all three families. But it never says what. No mention of gold or water or anything of value. Just the discovery." A cold shiver traced its way down Thomas's spine. A secret was one thing, but a secret with no name felt infinitely more dangerous. It left too much room for speculation, too much room for things to go wrong. He took the letter back and closed the folder with a sharp snap. The sound echoed in the confined space like a door slamming shut. And then they both froze. From high above, a new sound drifted down through the earth and wood. The muffled creak of heavy wagon wheels, the rhythmic plod of multiple horses. Voices followed, low, male, and commanding. Clara's face went white. She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Those aren't my people, Thomas," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. The tunnel, which had felt like a silent tomb just moments before, now felt like a trap closing in around them. The silence was broken. The secret was out. And whoever was arriving, they sounded like they knew exactly where they were going. Heavy boots hit the barn floorboards above them with a deafening thud. A man's voice, deep and laced with impatience, boomed down into the tunnel. "Miss Harrow, we know you're here. And Langston, don't bother hiding. We've come to see the tunnels, all of them, especially the ones your grandfathers sealed up." Thomas and Clara exchanged a look of pure shock. This wasn't a request. It was a demand. The voice belonged to someone who wasn't just arriving. They were taking possession. The voice came again, slower this time, dripping with a century of pent-up certainty. "The contract expires in 3 weeks. Our families have waited 50 years for this. We've come to claim what is rightfully ours." Clara's jaw was set, her knuckles white where she gripped her lantern. "The Cross family," she breathed. "It has to be." As if on cue, a new sound echoed from another corner of the barn, the splintering of wood, the groan of old planks being pried up. Thomas's stomach plummeted. They weren't using his entrance. They were making their own. Whoever these men were, they didn't need to stumble upon the secret. They came with their own map. A new beam of light cut through the darkness at the far end of the corridor, stretching long, menacing shadows toward them. 3 figures emerged from the gloom, their silhouettes backlit and imposing. The man in the lead was tall, with sharp, hawkish features and graying temples that matched the cold authority in his voice. "Marcus Cross," he said, his name an announcement of power. His eyes swept over the chamber, taking in every detail with the cold, appraising look of a landlord inspecting a long-neglected property. "For half a century, we've honored the silence," he said, his gaze settling on Thomas, then Clara. "But the agreement was always meant to outlive the men who signed it. Now it's our turn. Open the sealed chambers, or we'll do it ourselves." Marcus Cross descended the rest of the steps as if he owned them, his 2 sons flanking him like sentinels. They were broad-shouldered, silent men who moved with a practiced wariness, their eyes constantly scanning the shadows. Their boots hit the packed earth in a steady, rhythmic cadence, a drumbeat of invasion. Marcus stopped a few feet from Thomas, his lantern held high. The light carved deep lines into his face. "You must be Samuel Langston's grandson," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The resemblance is undeniable. Same stubborn jaw, same wary eyes. You carry his face like a curse." Thomas felt a hot surge of anger but held his ground, his hand tightening around the handle of his own lantern. Clara stood beside him, her posture rigid, her satchel of documents clutched to her chest like a shield. Marcus ignored her, his focus entirely on Thomas. "For 50 years, my family has watched this land. We've honored the silence, kept the truth buried, while the world up above forgot anything was ever here but pasture and dust. Did you really think these tunnels stayed intact by chance?" He gestured to the support beams. "My sons and I have been maintaining them, reinforcing the weak spots, clearing the passages. We've been living in shifts down here for months, Langston, waiting for the day the contract expired, waiting for our rightful share." The younger of his sons ran a hand along a wooden beam, tapping it with a craftsman's pride. "Every brace, every repair. You've been walking over our labor for years, Thomas, without ever knowing it." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. The mysterious footprints, the fresh supplies. It hadn't been some lone squatter. It had been the Crosses, secretly tending to their inheritance right under his nose. Marcus then turned and walked toward what looked like an ordinary stretch of tunnel wall. He ran his hand over the packed earth and timber until his fingers found a particular spot on a vertical support post. With a slow, deliberate press, the post shifted inward. There was a low click of a hidden latch, and an entire section of the wall groaned, sliding sideways to reveal a dark opening beyond. A sudden draft of air rushed out. It was cold, sharp, and carried a distinct metallic tang that clung to the back of the tongue. It was the smell of buried wealth, raw, potent, and immense. Clara took an involuntary step back, her eyes wide. Thomas felt it too, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. A small, satisfied smile touched Marcus Cross's lips. "There it is," he said, his voice thick with triumph. "The secret your grandfathers swore to protect. The reason for the contract, the silence, the 50 years of waiting." He swept his lantern into the opening, and the darkness gave way to a ghostly shimmer. The walls of the hidden chamber were laced with thick, brilliant veins of raw silver. It wasn't just a discovery, it was a treasure. The rock itself seemed to pulse with a faint, captured moonlight, the chisel marks of the original miners still visible on its surface. "This is why they built the tunnels," Marcus explained, his voice a reverent whisper. "Not to hide from the law, but to hide their profits. Silver. Enough to make kings out of dirt farmers. But kings don't pay taxes and they don't answer to governments. So our grandfathers dug in secret. They mined it, smelted it, and stored it where no one could ever lay a hand on it." He turned, the lantern light catching the hungry glint in his eyes. "They signed the contract to ensure no one family could get greedy and betray the others. They waited. But that time is over. The land has kept its promise, and the silver beneath our feet belongs to us." Thomas stepped past Marcus, his own lantern held high as he entered the hidden chamber. He was half expecting to be blinded by brilliance, to see crates overflowing with ore, shelves groaning under the weight of silver ingots, the accumulated treasure of half a century of secret labor. Instead, the chamber was a hollow, echoing tomb. Rows of empty wooden shelves lined the stone walls. Metal lockboxes that should have been too heavy to lift lay toppled on their sides, their lids pried open, revealing nothing but dust and cobwebs. Gouge marks scarred the floor where heavy containers had been dragged away. It was all gone, every last ounce. Marcus Cross's face, which had been alight with triumph just seconds before, drained of all color. He stumbled forward, running a hand along an empty crate, as if his touch could somehow conjure the silver that should have been inside. 50 years, he muttered, his voice a ragged, broken thing. 50 years of work, generations digging in secret, gone. His sons stood frozen in the entrance, their lanterns illuminating nothing but absence and despair. Thomas knelt by a discarded mining pick. The iron head wasn't rusted over. The edge was still sharp. Fresh dust, not ancient grime, clung to the wooden handle. He looked closer at the rock face itself. The chisel marks were clean, their grooves sharp-edged, not softened and blurred by the passage of decades. Whoever emptied this vault, they hadn't done it 50 years ago. They'd been here recently. Very recently. Clara moved to his side, her voice a low whisper of dread and certainty. Someone knew. She picked up a piece of a broken support beam, running her fingers over the raw, splintered wood. These timbers were cut within the last year, maybe the last few months. This place wasn't just robbed long ago. It's been actively worked, systematically emptied until there was nothing left. The younger Cross son let out a string of curses. "Impossible. We've been watching this land for months. We have men posted on the ridges. No one gets on or off this property without us knowing it." But Thomas wasn't listening. His lantern beam had caught a glint of white paper, half buried in the debris near the far wall. He bent down, brushed away the dirt, and carefully unfolded the scrap. The page trembled in his hands as he read the words. "It's a transport record," he said slowly, his voice tight. "For large shipments of silver ore. It's dated 3 months ago." His gaze shot to Clara. Her face was ashen. She was already staring at the page, her expression one of dawning horror. 3 months ago. the exact time she claimed to have been contacted by the mysterious lawyer, the exact time she'd started making her way here, following her great-grandfather's maps. The timing wasn't just a coincidence. It was a condemnation. Marcus Cross's eyes, which had been wide with shock, now narrowed into slits of pure fury. The storm of his suspicion gathered, and its lightning was aimed directly at Clara. "How convenient, Miss Harrow," he snarled, taking a menacing step toward her. "The silver vanishes right as you decide to show up and claim your share." The chamber, already cold, seemed to drop another 20 degrees. The air was no longer filled with the ghost of wealth, but with the poison of accusation. Marcus's suspicion hung in the stale air like smoke, and both his sons took a half-step forward, their postures shifting from shocked to threatening. All eyes were on Clara. Her face was pale, but she met Marcus's glare without flinching. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the tension. "I only came here because I was contacted by a man who told me where to find this place. He said his name was James Edwards, a lawyer from Millfield. He claimed my family had left documents in his care, papers that explained the contract and its expiration." The Cross sons exchanged a wary glance, but Marcus's scowl only deepened. "Edwards," he scoffed, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Never heard of him." Before Marcus's anger could boil over, Thomas stepped between them. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made everyone stop. "That's because there is no lawyer named Edwards in Millfield," he said, every word landing like a stone. "The lawyer's office above the general store has been shuttered for years. The place is empty. I know everyone in that town. There's no one there by that name." He locked eyes with Clara, and his expression was a complex mixture of pity and dawning comprehension. "Whoever contacted you, Clara, they lied about who they were." A thick, dangerous silence descended upon the chamber. The implications of Thomas's words uncoiled in the dark like a rattlesnake. Someone had posed as a lawyer. Someone who already knew about the 1852 contract, the three families, and the existence of the silver mine itself. They had fed Clara just enough truth to lure her to the ranch, ensuring she would arrive at the precise moment the vault was discovered to be empty. She wasn't a thief. She was a scapegoat. Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, the veins standing out on his forearms. "So we've been played," he growled. "All of us, the Langston, the Harrow, the Cross, manipulated into showing up here at the same time, ready to point fingers at each other." Clara's voice was barely a whisper, but it trembled with fury. "Whoever did this wanted us to tear each other apart. While we're down here fighting over an empty hole, they're already 100 miles away with everything." Thomas nodded grimly, the final pieces clicking into place. This wasn't a simple robbery. It was a masterfully orchestrated deception. "We're not fighting a thief," he said. "We're fighting someone who knows our history better than we do." The lantern flames seemed to flicker and dim, as if recoiling from the truth. The shadows in the chamber deepened, crowding in on them. They weren't rivals fighting over a fortune. They were pawns in a game that had been set in motion long before any of them had arrived. A slow, deliberate clap echoed from the main tunnel. It was a chilling, mocking sound that froze the blood in their veins. Every lantern, every head, swung toward the entrance of the silver chamber. A lone figure stepped out of the darkness and into the golden glow of the light. It was a woman, older than the rest of them, perhaps in her late 60s. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, dark and piercing, burned with a cold fire that looked like it had been tended for decades. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the faintest hint of a foreign accent. It was measured, precise, and as sharp as broken glass. "Excellent detective work," she said, a humorless smile touching her lips. You're much closer to the truth than you realize, Mr. Langston. Thomas instinctively stiffened, taking a protective step in front of Clara. Marcus Cross moved to shield his sons, his face a mask of aggression. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. The woman's gaze was utterly unwavering. It swept over them all, dismissive and powerful. "My name is Elena Vasquez," she announced, "and my grandfather, Roberto Vasquez, was the man who discovered this silver vein in 1851. He was the rightful owner, and he was the man your grandfathers betrayed, murdered, and buried somewhere in the dirt of this very tunnel." The words struck the chamber with the force of a physical explosion. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "That's impossible," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "My grandfather, he was an honest man." Elena's expression hardened into granite. "Your grandfather was a killer, Mr. Langston, along with Thomas Harrow and William Cross. My grandfather came to them in good faith. He was a prospector, not a businessman. He needed partners to help him secure the claim and manage the logistics. He trusted them." Her voice dropped, becoming thick with a lifetime of inherited bitterness. "But they didn't see a partner. They saw a treasure map. They saw his discovery as something to be stolen, not shared." From the deep pocket of her coat, she withdrew a small, battered leather journal, its pages yellowed and stained with age. She held it up for them all to see before opening it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The ink on the page was shaky, written with a trembling hand. Her voice was low and steady as she read the words aloud. "They have agreed to meet me at dawn in the new tunnel Samuel is constructing. We are to finalize the partnership. I pray my doubts are unfounded, but I fear they mean to betray me. If this is the last entry I make, let it be known that I was wronged. I fear I will not see another sunrise." The air in the chamber became thick, unbreathable. Every word she read was a death sentence, pronounced and carried out half a century ago. Clara's face was ghost white, her hand covering her mouth. "He knew," she murmured. "He suspected it." And he was right. Elena closed the journal with a sharp, final snap. The sound of the leather cover clapping shut echoed like a coffin lid slamming down. "Roberto Vasquez never came home from that meeting," she said, her voice like ice. "Instead, your grandfathers divided his discovery between the three of them, created a contract to ensure their silence, and erased his name from history. You have spent your lives living in their shadows, defending their so-called honor, while my family has carried nothing but the memory of their betrayal." Her piercing, silver-flecked eyes moved from Thomas to Clara to Marcus and his sons. They felt like daggers. "Now the truth is before you. The question is no longer what your grandfathers did 50 years ago. The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" The lanterns hissed in the suffocating silence, and for a long, terrible moment, no one dared to breathe. Marcus Cross stared at Elena, his face a storm of disbelief and rage. "You expect us to believe this? A convenient story from a stranger, backed up by a dusty old book." Elena did not flinch. Instead, she lifted her chin, her calm expression almost cruel in its certainty. "The silver is gone," she declared, her tone leaving no room for argument, "and it will never return to these tunnels. I have spent the last 5 years planning this. My people have spent the last 3 months carefully and quietly removing every last ounce of ore that your families stole. It has already been sold, and the money, it has already been put to use." Thomas's chest heaved. "Put to use for what?" Elena's eyes seemed to soften for a fraction of a second. "For schools, for hospitals, for communities in the South where my grandfather's true descendants live. Towns where the Vasquez name is remembered not as a forgotten victim, but as a legacy of strength and resilience. The wealth from this mine is finally building what it was always meant to build, a future, not for thieves, but for the family of the man who found it. She then raised her lantern higher, motioning for them to follow her back into the main tunnel. If you still doubt my story, then come. Come and see what your grandfathers left behind when they traded their honor for greed. She led them deeper into the network of tunnels, past the main chamber, to a section that was crudely boarded up. The wood was old, the nails rusted. It was a part of the tunnel that had clearly been sealed for decades. One of the cross sons, at Elena's direction, took a crowbar and pried the boards away. A wave of cold, stagnant air washed over them. Elena stepped through the opening, her lantern held high. The space beyond was not a tunnel. It was a shallow, makeshift grave. Against the far wall of the small earthen chamber lay skeletal remains. They were not scattered, but carefully arranged, as if someone had buried a body in haste, and it had been unearthed years later. A small, tarnished silver crucifix lay against the rib cage, its chain long since rotted away. Beside the skeleton was a cracked leather pouch containing a prospector's pick and other mining tools, their metal edges flaked with rust. But it was the skull that told the whole story. It was tilted slightly to one side, and even in the flickering lantern light, the cause of death was unmistakable. A small, dark, perfectly round hole punched clean through the back of the bone. Elena's voice did not waver. Roberto Vasquez, shot from behind, executed by the men he trusted as partners, your grandfathers, Samuel Langston, Thomas Harrow, William Cross. They built their family legacies on this grave, and for half a century you have mistaken murderers for pioneers. Clara let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Marcus Cross staggered back as if he'd been shot himself, his face pale and sickly. His sons stared at the remains with wide-eyed horror, the stories of family honor they'd been raised on, crumbling to dust before their eyes. Thomas stood frozen, the world tilting and spinning around him. The image of his grandfather, the strong, kind, righteous man he had idolized his entire life, shattered into a million pieces. "All these years," Clara whispered, her voice breaking, "we thought they were building something from nothing, but they were building it on blood." The silver crucifix on the skeleton's chest gleamed in the lantern light, a silent, damning testament. Every board in the barn, every fence post in the fields, every stone in the foundation of his home rested on this crime. Elena's gaze swept over their shattered faces. Her expression was hard, but it was not triumphant. It was filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. "You cannot change what your grandfathers did," she said, her voice softer now. "But you must decide how you live with it. Denial will only chain you to their sins forever. Acknowledgement, atonement, that is the only way forward." No one answered. The only sound in the tomb was the ragged, painful echo of their own breathing, mingling with the silent accusation of bones that had waited 50 long years to finally tell their story. Thomas stood in the makeshift tomb, the lantern light flickering across walls that now felt like they were closing in on him. Every story his grandfather had ever told him was a lie. Every lesson about hard work and honesty was a bitter hypocrisy. He ran a hand along the rough-hewn timber of the tunnel wall, a beam his grandfather's hands had likely set in place, and he felt a profound, soul-deep revulsion. What he had always thought of as his heritage was nothing but a carefully constructed mask pulled tight over the face of a murderer. This wasn't a legacy, it was a crime scene. The barn above, the fields outside, the very house he had been born in. It was all built on stolen ground, paid for with a good man's blood. The weight of that truth was a physical thing, pressing down on him, whispering that if he stayed, if he kept silent, he would be just as guilty as the man who pulled the trigger. He finally turned to face the others. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it was as solid and unshakable as the rock around them. "I can't live here anymore," he said. "I can't work land that was stolen from a dead man. I won't eat another meal in a house that sits on his grave. If I stay, I'm no better than they were." The words hung in the heavy, silent air. Clara looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, her lips parted as if to argue. Marcus Cross stood stiffly, his face a war of shame and anger. His sons just stared at the ground. But Thomas's expression was set. "This property," he continued, gesturing at the tunnels, the grave, the very earth around them. "The evidence, the bones, it doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to the Cross family. It doesn't even belong to the Harrows. It belongs to Roberto Vasquez's bloodline. They are the only rightful heirs to what was taken." Elena stood motionless, her silver hair seeming to glow in the lamplight. For the first time since she'd appeared, her cold fury seemed to recede, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. "Roberto had a child," she said softly. "A daughter. She died of fever when she was young. His wife, my great-grandmother, remarried and moved back east. I am the closest family he has left." Thomas nodded once, his decision absolute. "Then it belongs to you, all of it. The barn, the land, the house. I'll sign over the deed, every last acre. I would rather walk away from this place with nothing but the clothes on my back than live one more day on ground that was paid for with murder." His words cut through the chamber, sharp and final. But in his eyes there was a flicker of something new. Not just resolve, but relief. The relief of a man finally laying down a burden he never even knew he was carrying. 3 days later, the air in the county courthouse was stale with the smell of old paper and legal finality. Thomas sat at a long oak table, a pen in his hand, the deed to the Langston Ranch spread out before him. For generations, this paper had been the symbol of his family's identity, their sweat, their legacy. Now he knew it was nothing but a lie written on parchment. With a steady hand, he signed his name. Each stroke of the pen felt like severing a poisoned thread that connected him to the past. Marcus Cross and his sons signed next, their faces pale but resolved. They too had chosen to let the lie die. Across the table, Clara held the pen for a long moment, her hand trembling. For her, this land represented a history she had only just discovered. But after a long, silent pause, she pressed her signature firmly onto the page. The last chain was broken. Elena Vasquez, sitting opposite them, unfolded her own documents. Her expression was solemn, carrying neither triumph nor malice, only the somber weight of a duty fulfilled. She insisted on paying them all a fair market price for the land, not as an act of generosity, but as an act of restoration. This wasn't about vengeance, she explained. It was about correcting the balance. With the money, she promised, she would have Roberto Vasquez's remains exhumed and given a proper burial, his name finally carved into a headstone for the whole world to see. As Thomas pushed the heavy courthouse doors open and stepped out into the afternoon sun, he felt a weight lift from his chest. A pressure he had carried his entire life without ever understanding its source. For 35 years he had believed it was the weight of responsibility, the duty to uphold the Langston name, to live up to the legacy of his grandfather. But now, stripped of all illusion, he finally understood. It had never been duty. It was guilt, an inherited guilt, passed down from a murderer to his grandson. A silent, festering poison that had seeped into the very soil of the ranch. With the deed no longer his, the land was no longer a prison. He stood on the courthouse steps and looked west, where the sun was beginning its slow descent. For the first time, the horizon didn't feel like the edge of his world. It felt like a beginning. He would ride west, away from the shadows of this valley, and start over. He would build a life where every acre he tilled and every nail he hammered would be earned with his own honest sweat, not another man's blood. Clara came to stand beside him. "What will you do now?" she asked quietly. He answered without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "Earn what's mine, honestly," he said. "Build something new." He was no longer Samuel Langston's heir, bound by lies and blood money. He was just Thomas, a man who had chosen truth over inheritance, and in that choice he felt free. He mounted his horse, and as the town faded behind him, he knew he would never be the same. The man who had descended into that dark tunnel was gone, replaced by someone who understood that a true legacy isn't what you're given. It's what you choose to build. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of secrets and justice.